Okay, joining us today is Lang Allen, Managing Director with USAA Real Estate, where he oversees the domestic industrial logistics development platform. Lang, thank you for joining us today. It's good to have you.
Well, thank you very much, Jad. I'm really happy to be a part of this.
So Lang, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background for our listeners?
Yeah, sure, Jad. So, I originally started my career off with CBRE in Dallas shortly after graduating from SMU with a real estate finance double major. Started off in the brokerage business, transitioned from that to Weingarten Realty Investors, where I also handled all the industrial leasing throughout the Dallas-Fort Worth area. Did that for about 5 years and then transitioned into an asset management role with Weingarten out of the Houston office, overseeing all of Texas except for Houston, Southern California, and Memphis. And then actually joined USA Real Estate about 12 years ago. Spent the first little over 6 years in the asset management group, covering about half the country, and then ultimately running the entire industrial logistics asset management team to head up our U.S. development operations, again, right around 6 years ago or so, and I'm responsible for all of our development activities in the Continental 48.
It's terrific. I suspect, Lang, that you are quite busy these days. If we read the headlines, especially related to commercial real estate, we typically are reading about the demise of all things retail and whether or not companies, employers are going to downsize, shrink their space requirements. Is this remote working model going to, fundamentally shift a demand for office product within the commercial real estate asset class? But the darling is industrial. And again, that's your expertise. And tell us what you've been up to today.
Yeah, no, Judd. And I think, first and foremost, while there's no question that industrial and logistics properties are a focal point and a very active point, in the COVID environment we're in, I honestly would point back to the end of the GFC, as really, a attention focusing time frame for industrial. That's really when I think industrial as a whole became a recognized institutional asset class. Whereas prior to that, it was really considered a more de minimis, kind of diversification play. It didn't fall into the same categories as office, retail, and to some extent hospitality. There's no question we're extraordinarily busy today as a byproduct of COVID, but I think we were also extraordinarily busy the past couple of years as we've seen tremendous growth from e-commerce, in the post-GFC world, and in more particularly over the past 3 or 4 years.
And, Lang, maybe tell our listeners a little bit about why we've seen that increased interest in all things industrial, greater acceptance as part of, an asset class that an institution might want to invest in. What has happened within that space that's led to this demand?
Yeah, so it's a great question, Dad. I think, really what drove a lot of it was people's experiences during the GFC with other asset classes as compared to industrial. Two primary drivers being, you generally have mission critical facilities with respect to industrial operations or logistics operations. So they're generally the last ones that are shed from a business operation perspective. Secondly, they are far less capital intensive in most cases on a per square foot basis to re-tenant as well as to carry. So, the average operating expense carry for an industrial asset is somewhere between $1 to $2 a foot. And the average re-tenanting cost is probably in the neighborhood of $2 to $5 a foot, as compared to office properties, which can, have operating expense carries, well in excess of $15 to $20 a foot a year, and tenant improvement costs that can also be in excess of $40 to $60 or even $80 a foot. So I think, furthermore, there was, the industrial asset class, specifically Class A, was extraordinarily resilient from both an occupancy and just an overall financial health during the GFC. While our portfolio did suffer some, as did everyone's, I think we bottomed out around 87 or 88% overall occupancy in the operating portfolio that USA had at the time. and that was only for 2 quarters, and then continued operating north of 90%. That has been the case since the GFC through today, where we currently are operating just shy of 99% occupancy on our stabilized portfolio of assets, not including those assets that are actively under development that we could not actually lease.
That's amazing. 99% occupied. Talk to me a little bit about, obviously, COVID and it's been called an accelerant of many things, one of which is, moving all things online, in particular, groceries, shopping, Amazon, and others have really been the beneficiaries. And I know you've got a deep relationship with Amazon that we'll speak to here in a moment. But talk to our listeners a little bit, if you would, about how e-commerce has been accelerated as a result of the pandemic and its impact on the industrial space.
Yeah, so obviously, COVID, presented a challenge for all of us, right? I mean, the concept of going into a grocery store and picking up goods, at your leisure, was basically completely inhibited. As shutdowns took place across the country and consumers were forced to buy and procure assets through different mediums. I think many of the large retailers were building out, with the exception of Amazon, as you mentioned, e-commerce execution platforms, but had, for the most part, and in many cases, struggled. Many of them were focused on click and collect, which is order online, go pick up in store, or some sort of other multi-channel medium for e-commerce. COVID really required them to shift that entire model. Not to say that they couldn't pull up in a store and pick things up, but there weren't dedicated, online pickup delivery there that didn't exist in restaurants for the most part. The very few of the grocery stores had a dominant share of their parking area dedicated to that type of execution. And so it really forced the retailers and the consumers to adopt different ways to shop. The analogy that I use is, I can't imagine how many different parents and grandparents, and including my own, that I have had to teach how to use Amazon. And the e-commerce adoption rate, as it's referred to in the industry, grossly accelerated as a byproduct of COVID. Many times exceeding what the out-year projections were for 3, 4, or 5 years from January of 2020.
That's just remarkable to think about. You mentioned Amazon, and I know you have a deep relationship with them. Can you maybe describe what Amazon's response has been as kind of a leader in this space, right, for all things e-commerce and distribution? Talk to us a little bit about how they've responded and what has trickled down to you and USAA Real Estate to support what they're trying to now accomplish through and beyond this pandemic.
Yeah, so it was actually very interesting, Jad. Early portions of the pandemic, I think Amazon and most retailers hit what was the pause button, right? They evaluated, what is this going to mean for our business? I don't think anybody necessarily was able to calculate whether it would be positive or negative. So we did see across our industrial portfolio what I would say was a pause in that March and April timeline, where companies evaluated what was viable, what was not viable. Transactions were placed on hold. We did the same thing. If we were committed to projects and under construction, we continued with them. If we had the ability to somehow delay them, that's what we did. So our industry as a whole did that for about 60 or 90 days. And once we started to see, specifically many of the e-tailers and even some of the conventional retailers, acknowledging that their ordinary distribution networks and models that to execute on e-commerce didn't work or were inadequate for the amount of demand they were experiencing, they committed to expanding that network significantly. And I think you may have alluded to it a little earlier in the call. We are seeing an unprecedented demand from the e-commerce users, as well as traditional retailers and just general industrial users, third-party logistics providers, and others in terms of their need and demand for warehouse space to service not just e-commerce, but also increased inventory levels. You know, I always used to joke early in my career. I said, you know, my entire industry would be obsolete if just-in-time delivery were capable and worked, right? We would not have to warehouse anything, right? If everybody had a 3D printer, we could eliminate all the warehouses across the world, and we would just get what we wanted when we wanted it. You know, what COVID proved is that, you know, the 1 month safety stock that was pretty common throughout the industry was grossly inadequate to meet, you know, a COVID type demand. You know, we all know about the shortage of toilet paper. We all know about the shortage of paper towels. We all know about the shortage of essential goods. And that was largely based upon the fact that, you know, safety stocks were at, you know, truly ridiculously low levels, inadequate to support what happened. So what we have heard and what we are seeing is that, you know, whereas a 2 or 3 month safety stock may have been a pre-COVID norm, 6 month safety stock is now what they need. And, you know, even in industrial real estate, a guy can conclude that if 3 was what was required before and 6 is what's required now, you need twice as much.
You know, let's go a little bit out of the pandemic and COVID. Can you describe for the listener Amazon's facilities and maybe differentiate between those facilities that you construct for them?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. And I think, you know, oftentimes people, you know, see a concrete rectangle and call it an industrial or logistics facility and think that that's, you know, it's just, you know, trucks going in and trucks going out. You know, what's interesting about, you know, Amazon's network, or quite frankly, any e-commerce company, is that differs from a traditional warehouse, and is in a traditional warehousing environment, products were generally brought in a full pallet load. They were somehow reorganized and left the building in a full truck on a full pallet. The fulfillment center network, which is what e-commerce companies do, including Amazon, is effectively in a fulfillment center building. They take that palletized product and break it down into the unit level, whereby when you click on that product to purchase it, that singular unit or multiple units can then move throughout the building and be placed into a box that is sealed for your individual shipment and delivery. So it is a far different process inside of that concrete building than what you would have in a traditional retail environment, which is why many of the traditional retailers have had a significant struggle trying to take a conventional warehouse building and make it e-commerce capable. If you think about it in a very simplistic way, Jad, if I'm Walmart and I have a pallet of size large socks, it doesn't make any economic sense to accept an individual order in that warehouse and send a singular forklift driver over to pull a pallet of size large socks and pull one unit out to then have him carry it across the building and put it in a box. So when you think about it in that context, what it requires companies to do is really build out a completely separate facility and network to accommodate the ability to take a pallet, break a pallet into a unit, and fulfill an individual order that you have placed, hence the term fulfillment center.
And, you know, I've been inside these facilities with you and others. Can you describe a little bit for the listener what the inside of these facilities look like in order to accomplish what you've been describing in terms of processing and fulfillment?
Yeah, it's a great question. And you've certainly seen the evolution of buildings, you know, over the course of time, where first generation buildings included somebody with, you know, for lack of a better description, looked like a grocery cart going down an aisle, you know, picking individual items, to highly automated facilities today that can in fact have, you know, automated conveyor systems totaling, you know, 15 or 20 miles. Many of the facilities, you know, are equipped with advanced robotic technology, which will allow inventory to actually be moved by robots, and to the extent they can be, even pulled, picked, and packaged by robots. You know, just the individual package sortation capabilities, the automatic label reading on conveyor systems is quite frankly astonishing, such that, you know, as packages are packaged and they are labeled, the individual outbound boxes are separated by conveyor systems into individual semi trucks that service certain specific areas of the region or the country for that matter.
And with the potential for driverless vehicles, you can see a potentially fully automated robotic process in terms of fulfillment and delivery. Eventually, tell me a little bit about your thoughts on how this all impacts the employee base. Do you see these robotics and advancements in technology ultimately cannibalizing what otherwise would have been a job for an actual individual?
So it's a great question, and I would say that in general, many of these e-commerce facilities, while they have added significant robotics capabilities, we have not seen a significant decrease in the human FTE counts. In fact, we've actually seen the FTE counts in many of these buildings increase, because what the robotics has actually enabled them to do is increase productivity. And with that increased productivity of total volume of packages, even though that would naturally say, if I was using the same number of packages, I could have reduced my employment count. What we've seen, however, is the inverse, which is they've increased the number of packages and increased the number of employees along with it. So you use less employees per package, but you have a significant number more employees, or the same number of employees that you may have had in an older, more traditional type of building, because you still need the employees.
Lang, I just want to pull back a little bit too, and maybe for the listener, describe, typically in the field of finance, investment banking, consulting, corporate finance, these are the traditional career paths for our listeners and for the students. Talk a little bit about the commercial real estate alternative asset class, how you found your way. You mentioned earlier that you also have a finance degree, and how, that career path that you have chosen has led you to industrial development.
Yeah, no, Jad, it's a great question. It's one that, quite frankly, I have, rather frequently as I interview, analysts and rotational analysts and new people join the firm. The natural progression for most people, at least what they think when they come out of, graduate school or undergraduate with a finance degree, is that they want to be focused on development or acquisition activities. My personal recommendation to them is to gain some level of ground floor operating experience within the real estate, because that really provides them a much more well-balanced foundation to do the appropriate level of underwriting for both development and acquisitions. And what I mean by that is really what we at USA Real Estate refer to as asset management, which is the physical operation and running of a real estate asset or a portfolio. And what I remind people constantly is, the development and acquisition underwriting is only as good as the people that could actually do it on the ground floor. And the people that actually have to do it are the people in asset management. So one of the things we've implemented at USA Real Estate a number of years ago, which is I was instrumental in influencing, is what we refer to as a rotational analyst program. Because I think it's very important for young people entering the commercial real estate industry to understand and have some level of experience with all the different components. So we actually take our individuals and rotate them every 6 months through various departments in our company, so that they can better understand the different phases of commercial real estate, what different departments operate and how they fit together. And quite frankly, I think it has generated a tremendous education for those people. And we have seen a far better, more well-rounded group of people come into permanent employment with us. And those departments are generally development, acquisitions, portfolio management, and asset management, which are the 3 key food groups to operating commercial real estate properties.
No, that's terrific. The concept of a rotation program and allowing entry-level employees as well to understand what their preferences are, and how these various job descriptions align with their own skill sets and specialties and strengths. That makes a lot of sense. So how did you break through this industry? What did your first job look like? How did you find it? Especially for a student today who's living in these unprecedented moments and times, right, of a pandemic, and they're looking to secure employment, desired employment. You know, how did you break through? And then from there, maybe talk a little bit about what you would propose they be thinking about and doing to really separate themselves, distinguish themselves, to secure, their desired employment.
Yeah, no. And so, the answer that I always give people is how did I get in industrial real estate it was the shortest line. And that is the honest truth. No, having graduated from SMU, I had some exposure to the brokerage business and other, peers that had gone into the brokerage business. And so, I went to work for CBRE. After a series of interviews, I was hired, and I remember sitting with Rand Holman, and Rand's like, "I'm hiring you. What do you want to do?" And the only thing I knew at the time is I said, "Well, I'll do office or retail." And he said, "Well, I have no openings in either of those two disciplines. What do you know about industrial?" And I said, "I don't know anything, but I guess if that's where you have an opening, that's where I'm going to work." Quite frankly, today I count myself as blessed as to, having the opportunity to do that. I was an engineering major for the first 2 years of my career. So, stepping into, something that was industrial actually worked out very well for me. I then progressed and continued in a brokerage capacity, really, cutting lease transactions on a day-to-day basis, working for Weingarten Realty. I think both of those experiences on the brokerage side of the business were invaluable, because you actually get to appreciate and understand that somebody on the ground has to sit across the table from somebody else and try to make a reasonable deal. And each situation is a little bit different. I always remind people that every piece of real estate is unique and finite. And so, somebody and every person is a different individual. So somebody may be willing to pay you a little bit more to have a corner spot here, or a little bit more to be, in a different location. So in a brokerage capacity, you're really tasked with managing that individual personality, the ownership needs and desires, and return thresholds. And then you're doing it at a little bit higher level in an asset management capacity, whereby you're actually overseeing the property management personnel and the leasing personnel. So, my career path, I think, was not overly unique in that, I went from brokerage to asset management, which is something I am seeing far more frequently today. The asset management to the development role, was one that came fairly naturally to me, because I understood and dealt with most of our tenants on a day-to-day basis in an asset management role. And I had understood what their needs were coming out of the brokerage business, or I was comfortable dealing with them in that respect. And then, shifting that over and adding the complexity of building a building just adds another layer to it.
So you're kind of building blocks, right? You're climbing a ladder. Yeah.
I mean, I look at them now, Jad, as we're talking through this in hindsight, the brokerage side of it gives you the experience of how to negotiate with people. The asset management side gives you the experience to operate the real estate and while still negotiating with people. And then, the development side of it just brings yet another piece to that puzzle that, now you can take a relationship with a person and understanding of what the needs and returns parameters need to be from an asset management perspective, and what the pitfalls of operating real estate to make the best possible development transaction deal.
You've been talking a lot about relationships and the ability to negotiate, to interact, to communicate face to face. Talk to me a little bit about how relationships and developing those relationships, both before your entry-level position into this industry and then throughout your industry. How has it impacted your career?
Yeah, so I would tell you, especially in the industrial space and, true across the commercial real estate industry as a whole, it is an extraordinarily small world. I mean, today I was on the phone with a gentleman that I sat next to in 1999 at CB, who was handling leasing for me in Dallas. So I can't stress the importance of relationships across the industry, even across commercial property types. There are many participants that, are active in office, active in industrial, active in multifamily. Although there has been a trend and a shift towards specialization by asset type, I would tell you that, whether it's developers that participate in different segments of the market, capital partners, much like USA Real Estate is, all the way through, brokerage firms, the relationships that you build over the course of your career are instrumental in helping your career. So what I always advise younger people as they're looking at entering the commercial real estate business is don't be afraid to cold call somebody. Don't be afraid to reach out. Don't ever burn a bridge where at all possible. That's where I've seen, quite frankly, some people make some of the largest mistakes in their careers is, fighting over the $2,000 commission on a deal that you just didn't need to, or it wasn't right to do so. Sometimes, especially early in your career, that can be a very hard thing because $2,000 is the rent for that month, right? Or the rent for the next 2 months. But I would always suggest and advise people to err on the side of good behavior as opposed to bad behavior, or err on the side of do the right thing as opposed to the wrong thing, even though it may in the short term cost you something.
Yeah, very much take the long view, right? Especially at the outset of your career. That's wise counsel. An additional question, Lang, that I have for you: what will be the top performing sector within the commercial real estate space in 5 years?
Wow, Jed, that's a loaded question. It's going to be industrial without question. Look, I think that's a hard one to answer. I think there's so much uncertainty as a byproduct in many respects of COVID to be able to say that, office will outperform, hospitality will outperform, multifamily, retail. What I can, however, say is I do think that those assets are going to look somewhat different in a post-COVID environment. I think we do have some level of systemic change. I think, the norm of the office building is going to be a little bit different. I think the expectations for retail and what that looks like will also be different. I do think that, industrial is, like I said this a little bit before the pandemic, that we were peaking already and may have been a little overpriced or a little bit too aggressive. I look now at where we are, and I certainly think industrial has some room to run. Does it run another 5 years, at the pace that it's running right now? I honestly don't know. But I can tell you that we are in the midst of a systemic change as to the way consumers buy products today. And if you believe that we are continuing down the path of higher e-commerce penetration rates, higher e-commerce acceptance, then I think the bet is likely to be made in industrial as opposed to retail, for example. And look, I'm not saying there aren't some fortress retail properties that, will stand the test of time irrespective of what the world looks like after COVID. But, I think they're likely, and everybody brings up malls in my industry, the redevelopment of malls. I think this situation has shown where the weaknesses existed before COVID and is just accelerating the process of getting rid of them.
Right. Yeah. Yep. Lang, this has been incredibly helpful. It's been a real pleasure to speak with you and to hear your institutional perspectives and knowledge and share that with our students and all of our listeners, and just really appreciate it. Thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, well, thanks, Jad. And as you know, I'm always happy to share information and industrial, when I was in school was not something that was even talked about for the most part. And so, I given everything that's going on in the world and the change of its asset class and perception, I welcome the opportunity to share this knowledge with, your listeners and you in particular, as you know.
Absolutely. I can't wait till the next time. Thanks so much, Lang.
All right, Jad. Take care.